Um, just let me check if we are live right now. Okay.
Yeah.
Just let me quickly check. Yeah. So we are live on YouTube. So I
Great.
like welcome folks to this very new webinar. So we'll be talking about configuration as code in this webinar, and we have Ran with us from Configu. So um, Ran, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Ayash. So I'm Ran Cohen. I'm living in Tel Aviv. I'm 30 years old. I'm living with my girlfriend and my cute dog, my cute puppy dog. For the past 12 years, I'm a developer. I'm working as a developer in the Israeli tech startup. Um, I've been working in many startups, and for the last 2 years, together with my co-founder Peleg Porat, which is the CEO of Configu, we started Configu, and this is what we are going to talk about today. Very exciting.
So let's start with the session quickly, and then I'll just add your screen, and you can go ahead. Yeah.
Cool. So I already introduced myself. So I'm Ron. I will be the host for today. And in the agenda of today, we are going to dive into the world of configuration as code and Configu. And we're going through what are application configuration, what is configuration as code, what is Configu, and we'll end up with a live demo and Q&A session. If you want to dive deeper, you are more than welcome to get into my Dev2 blog post series that talks about configuration as code. Practically, this whole presentation is based on this series blog post. So feel free to dive deeper. I guess this presentation will be at the Discord channel when we add, so you will have all the necessary links right there. Um, so I want to start by talking about application configuration. And think about application configuration as a bunch of settings that tells your software how to act. It's like giving a specific instruction to a video game so it knows how to start, what the level of difficulty, and what players to act at the game. Um, so there is a handy guide that calls the 12-factor app. Um, some folks might say that this guide is a bit of an old school, but I think it does a pretty good job at explaining the basics of configs. And the most important quote from there, you can see this section 3 config at the 12-factor app. But the most important quote from there is that app config is everything that is likely to vary between deploys, staging, production, developer environments, and etc. etc. So you're more than welcome to dive deeper and read the whole section. It talks deeply about application configuration. So in today's software creation process, it's very common for developers to keep some of settings separate from the actual code. What they does practically, they put those settings in some separate locations or separate files that basically what we call application configuration. And it's crucial because it lets the developers change how the software acts and meet the different needs of the application when it gets deployed to either of its deployment system. So for examples, application configuration may include things like environment variables, secrets, feature flags, and such settings data. etc., etc. So the challenges with app configs reveal themselves as our code base grows and gets longer and more complicated. When the code base is getting large, there's practically more settings that you might need to make sure it works right. So nowadays, in the whole microservices buzzword, when you have very separated softwares or services that working together, um, it means that basically those settings, those application configuration are spread all over the place. And this makes it hard for teams to ensure that everything is set up correctly in those terms. And it may lead to misconfiguration. So wrong or old settings like those can cause a lot of problem and making your software not act as you wish it to act. And it can lead to even downtime and lost revenue, etc., headaches that we don't like. So managing these settings, those application configuration is super important to keep our system stable and our team working smoothly. It's a key to know what settings are used and where, and have a way to keep them correct and up to date all the time. So those are application configuration. Now let's talk a little bit about configuration as code. So at Configu, we talked to a lot of folks. We are running for 2 years now, and we talked with engineers, with DevOps people, with ops teams, with many guys at the thing called R&D or development team. In small startups to large corporates, we talked with many of them all the time. And what we find is some major problems in how they handle application configuration. Basically, everyone says that they are all over the place and that they are saved as simple text files or raw text files in many different spots like databases, files, third-party system, etc., etc. And very often, they even coupled with the technology, even if it's the same project, the configuration are coupled with the technology. So all this mix-up leads to a messy situation and a lack of common standards, and it may cause to serious configuration mistakes that, as I mentioned before, everyone wants to avoid them. So I like gathered a couple of the main challenges that we heard from all those conversation with the tech guy. So the first challenge is the complexity of those configuration, and the fact that they are scattered and inconsistent make them really hard to understand. Whenever developer joins a new team or a company, they need to face up a learning curve to figure out where are those settings, what are their values in production and development, in some dev environments, etc., etc. Another challenge is that it's slowing down the development pace. So all this chaos around configuration takes a lot of time from the developers and slowing down the actual coding work. Also, it makes them feel that it's risky to change those configuration because they fear from errors. Inability to scale is another challenge. It's very hard to change configuration quickly because they are scattered, and it can slow down or block scaling up the code or the application or the deployments. Configuration, and another challenge is internal friction. So if we don't manage those configuration well, it can create bottlenecks between developers and DevOps departments to ops team. It causes some tension around them because it's an extra task that each one expects the other to accomplish. Another challenge is the lack of governance around configuration. Basically, there is no an oversight or a one-stop shop that shows you all the configuration. And it can lead to potential errors in production, which we may fear, of course. Another challenge is lack of developer focus. So if developers needs to deal with building some custom solution for configuration management in-house, so it's divert them from the actual main goal of the business. So they deal with some sidekick project that helps them with the configuration. And the last challenge that we hear is that basically configuration are understood mostly by specific team members. And if they leave your organization, the knowledge goes with them. So we face with some configuration data loss. So those are like oversight of the challenges that we heard from those people that we talked with. So we at Configu set ourselves a clear goal to address those challenges and develop a solid foundation for managing configuration that will work in practically any use case for any organization in any technology. So we like huddled in a room for a few months when we started Configu and brainstorming about the best approach to tackle those challenges. And after we looked at infrastructure as code and all of the buzzword around it, we saw that if we can take the good stuff from infrastructure as code, and like bring them to configuration world, we can create a new term that's called configuration as code. And why not like betting on a winning formula of infrastructure as code that is very widely adopted? So this is how configuration as code, or in short, CAC, came to life. So if we're going to dive a little bit how CAC and like solve those challenges and what features and smart ideas bring to the table. So the first thing is that it brings consistency and reproducibility. Basically, CAC gives you the ability to keep configuration consistent across different settings because they are practically handled as part of your code. Another feature is versioning and tracking. So if you change configuration via code, they are tracked over time, they committed to your Git, to your repository. It's making it very easy to see who changed what and when. Another benefit of CAC is automation and efficiency. So there's no more manual working or in-house solution that you need to build because CAC allows you to build automation very easily around those application configuration and making deployment very faster and smoother. Another feature is the ability to scale. So if it's very easy for us to adjust and the configuration via code because it's the same as we change our code, we can scale and meet the changing needs of that application need to fulfill more quickly. Another cool benefit is that if we treat configuration as code, we get collaboration and teamwork because it helps developers and ops teams and stakeholders to work together with their familiar tooling in more harmoniously way. There's no tension or between those persona inside the R&D because they just have to speak around configuration the same as they speak on code. Another benefit, it is basically simplifies the whole configuration management process because it gives you a clear structure to how to manage configuration and make them easier to understand and adopt. And by doing that, it basically eliminates any chance for manual errors or reduces the risks for manual mistakes. And by that, give developers and DevOps teams more confidence to change those configurations. Yeah, so those are all the benefits that CAC gives you. And what we do at Configu, we want to take configuration management to a whole new level, to something like, if you think about what the world was before you had GitHub and GitLab and all those fancy code repositories. This is what we want to do at Configu, taking configuration to the next level, give you a one-stop shop to manage configuration, a clear focus. Next up, I want to talk and introduce to you to Configu, which basically the first implementation of the CAC ideas for application configuration. So we took all the benefits of CAC and we developed an open source project that implements all of them and bring them to life. So Configu is, as it said in its GitHub repo, you can see it here, is basically a simple and a modern and generic standard for managing and collaborating on software configuration. And it is built to provide a common, flexible, and extensible process for storing, mutating, and orchestrating configuration data across different environments and systems. In short, it implements the CAC ideas. So with Configu, you can leverage all the power of CAC and ensure a streamlined and efficient configuration management in your team, in your organization. So you can jump to the GitHub repo. We would really appreciate a star, and we are looking for contributors, so feel free to join the team. We're really looking forward to have you there. So back to the Configu stuff. So to get a better understanding of how Configu works, and for later on the live demo that I'm going to show, I want to introduce you to a few core concepts of Configu, what basically the foundation for how we at Configu implemented the CAC idea. So the first concept is a config. And a config is practically the data model that represents with Configu an application configuration. You can think about it as an object with three properties: a key, a value, and a set. And I will talk about either one of them very shortly. So Configu is practically an interface, a representation, a data model. You can name it how you like. Configu basically work with those configs, read them, write them, etc. etc. The next concept is a config store. And it's basically where those configs are saved and read from. It can be any storage engine that can save any type of data. It can be a text file, a database, a feature flag system, a secret manager, a third-party service, an HTTP service that writes something to somewhere. It can practically be any storage engine that can hold those configs for Configu. You can also, when you jump into the repository of Configu, you can see that you can also implement your own custom config store. And this is what makes Configu very extensible, because you have the freedom to choose where you save your configuration. So this is practically a config store. And it's important to say that Configu also developed the platform, the Configu platform, which served as a config store. And yeah, and it looked like that. And I will probably cover most of its features in the next webinar or something. We will not have time for it today. But practically, it's a config store, the same as a JSON file, but it gives you more features like a audit log, the ability to apply some authorization about your configuration, some webhooks, and advanced features that your team might need to collaborate more efficiently, like this dashboard with some visualizations, etc., etc. Going back to the deck. So the next concept that I want to introduce is a config set. And config set is practically a tree structure that has some nodes that represent a context of a config value. So let's say I have some configuration for my production environment. If I want to group all those configuration under the node of production, the config set at this node of the tree will hold all the values, all the configs for the production, for the dev. And I know it might be confusing, but I guess you will understand it better when I will show the demo. You can think about Configset as practically as a context that groups config values together. And the idea behind modelizing it as a tree is that if we modelize something as a tree, we can utilize features like inheritance and override values of configuration between the environment. I will show it in the demo. The next concept, and the most important one, I think, that I want to introduce is a config schema. Basically, this is the main implementation of the configuration as code ideas. So this is basically a file that this file has binding records between config key, this key, to a declaration of this configuration. I will show an example of it in the demo, but you can also see it right here. Basically, you take a configuration key that your code needs, and you set what its type of value needs to be, what its default value, whether it's required. You can attach some descriptors and more restrictions around it. And we call this a CFGU declaration. It's basically a file with a CFGU suffix. And the last concept is not really a concept, but it's configure in practical. What these open source actually contain is a bunch of interfaces, like developer interfaces, like SDKs in many different programming languages, CLI, IDE plugin, all those familiar tools that developer work with when developing code, that this all package, those all interfaces, uses all those four concepts, the config store, config set, and config schema, to really implement the CAC specification as I talked about it before. And the flow of working with Configu basically goes like that. So if I'm the user, from the user perspective, I'm going to look at some code of mine, and I'm going to look at what configuration or application configuration needed for this code to run correctly. Then what I'm going to do is describe those configuration at the schema file, like you can see here. And then I'm going to treat this file same as I'm treating the code. I'm going to push it and sync it and update it when I'm changing configuration. And when I'm adding new configuration, I'm going to push it to the Git back and forth and continuously update it when I'm changing configuration. And this is the config schema. And it's important to say that actually you can have a bunch of those CFGU config schema files in what way you think best modelize your code. You can have a bunch of them under the same directory, under cross repositories, wherever you feels like you need one. So we created this schema and pushed it together with the code. And then what you need to do from the user perspective is basically select the interface that you need, whether it's CLI or SDK, based on the phase in the life cycle, on the application life cycle that you are at. So if I'm going to build or deploy my application, I'm going to pick the CLI, and if I need the configuration at runtime, I'm going to use the SDK. So let's say I'm picking the CLI. So the first thing I want to do is basically add some value to those configs that I declared in the schema. So for this, I will trigger the upsert command that gets as parameters a store, a set, and a schema. And basically, basically what it does, it takes some values from you as an input, validate them against the schema, and save the new values, the new configs, as at the config store that you picked as part of this command. And later on, when you deploy your application, let's say in CI/CD, in CI/CD system, etc., you activate the export command, giving it the config store that you picked when you upserted those values, a set and a schema. And then what this export command does, it's fetching those configs from the store, double validates them against the schema, and then what it does, it can inject the configuration to your runtime or produce yourself a configuration file or artifact as you may need based on the technology you use. So let's say you work with JavaScript, you probably want it as a .env or a JSON. And let's say if you work with, I don't know, with Golang, you want it as a TOML. And if you deploy to Kubernetes, you want the configuration as a config map or Helm chart. So we can give you the configuration artifact based on the technology that you pick. This is what the export command does. And then you practically run and continuously deploy your application. So Configu get involved in your CI/CD pipeline for environment variable, etc. And at runtime for feature flags and things of configuration that change frequently for runtime, you use and incorporates the SDK. So hopefully I didn't confuse you, but this is basically how the flow goes. And now for the fun part, and I think it will complete for you the whole picture of how Configu works. I'm going to use GitHub Code Spaces. If you like, you can also If you like, you can also start your own right here. Just press add, and you can get yourself this repository spinned up. I will give it a short time to start, and then we'll start. So basically what I want to show in this demo, I talked with Kunal, and he said most of you guys like Python. So I created a simple Python app, this one, that what it does, it actually prints an environment variable that it reads to the std out, to the output. So environment variable is one of the common implementation of application configuration. Basically, every runtime or every executable implements getting configuration via environment variable. So I created a Python app that reads an environment variable that's called message and print it to the std out with another line of Py. So this is the Python application. I'm going to use the Configu CLI to work with Configu. It's very convenient, and it's already installed on the code space, so it's very easy to start using it. I'm going to use for config store a JSON file just for you to see how the config look like. And next, I will going to use an SQLite file to save my configuration at. I'm going to use those contexts as Configset, dev prod, prod/earth, and prod/space. The slash here is meaning that space and earth are a child of prods. And I'm going to use the config schema that's called get started. It looks like that. And let's jump to the code space. I guess it's already open. Cool. So let's open our Python application. Let's open our Python application. Great. And let's open this file. Just for a quick note, this file is the configuration file of the CLI. You can see that I declared two config stores. One is a JSON file and one is an SQL. And this is where the SQLite file and this is where the JSON file store. They are all here. And let's go step by step and start with the demo. I will get it bigger so all of you can see it better. Hopefully, this is enough. Yeah. So let's go to the hello world. Yeah. See the example. Hello world. Cool. So I'm at the directory. Now, the first thing would be to install the CLI, but as I mentioned before, the CLI is already installed. And what coming next is we want to create our first schema. So to create a schema, we have the Configu init command. And for this demo, I'm going to use a pre-made schema with the get started flag. And here it is, a bit. This code space is a little bit slow, so this is why it's taking it some time, but in very short period, yeah, this is it. Let's take a look at this getstarted.cfgu.json file. This is practically the config schema that we talked about. So what we see here is three declarations. The first one is called greeting. The second one called subject, and the third one called message. And this is what's going to go to the application at the very last. So greeting is saying, I'm typing my values as regex with this pattern. So practically, this config can hold values that only meets this regex pattern. And it has a default value of hello. Subject is a string with default value of world, and message is a string that templates another cool feature of the CFGU schema file. It templates the greeting and the subject to create this final string. And also, as you can see, you can attach description so you can collaborate easily on what the job for the message at the code. Basically, here it generates a full greeting message and print it to the std out. Cool. So this is the schema file. And now comes the fun part. Let's activate the first upsert command, as I mentioned before. So upsert command looks like this. I'm going to do configu upsert to the stored called JSON, as you can see here, with the context of dev, with the schema of getstarted.cfgu.json, and I'm going to assign for the greeting hey, and for the subject we make devs community. Cool. So now what Configu does behind the scenes, it validates that hey is meeting the regex, that this meets the string, and it writes to the JSON file, to the JSON store, two configs. You can see the key set and value. For the greeting get assigned for the set context, hey value, and for the subject, for the same context of dev, it assigned we make devs community. If we change the set to, I don't know, to prod, and change, I don't know, and let's say we want to assign for the greeting something that not meets the regex, it will block me for doing it because it said invalid config value. It must be one of the regex. And if I'm just doing, I don't know, welcome, it will write another config for this time for greeting with the prod context with value of welcome. Great. So this was I just used the JSON store file to let you actually look at the config. Now what I'm going to use is the SQLite to save those configs. So I'm going to switch for a Configu upsert with the SQLite. I passed it right here. So let's going through it very quickly. So same config upsert, but now instead of a JSON store, I'm going to pass an SQLite store. First with the context of dev, same schema, and now I'm assigning greeting with hey and subject with everyone. Another upsert with the context of prod, same store, same schema, and now I'm assigning for greeting welcome. Same store, same schema. Now the context is prod/r, and now I'm assigning for subject human, the value of human, and for prod/space, I'm assigning for subject the value of alien. All those configs are upserted. Our store DB, which we can open because it's an SQL and we need a special viewer for this, but believe me, they are written to this file. And now what I want to do is basically return to my application and run it with those configs. So let's try first attempt to run this index/py just like this. And I will get an error because I didn't supply the message. The way to supply the message at Linux or Linux-based system is passing it before the command. So if I'm assigning for the message, hey, run, sorry, I need those. So the program starts and prints a run. But now what I want to do is using the Configu export command to inject the configuration based on the context that we provided, that we entered them, and run my application in multiple contexts. So let's start by running our first, let's end basically with running our first Configu export command. So it's a Configu eval, pretty different terms, but it's basically meaning the same. So Configu eval with the SQL store, config store, with the set, the context of prod/space and the schema of get started. And I'm going to pipe the output to Configu export that run my application and inject the configuration behind the scenes. And then what I'm going to see is welcome alien. And why is that? Because if you remember, we assigned for the prod the value of, for the context of prod, we assigned for greeting welcome. And for prod/space, we assigned for the subject the value of alien. So it gets welcome alien if you climb the tree up to the root node. Let's change the context to prod/hearth. And you will see that we'll get welcome human because we assigned for the prod/hearth the value of, for the subject, the value of human. If we change it to, I don't know, to dev, sorry, we'll get, hey everyone, same as we assigned. So this is how I'm like completing the life cycle of using the Configu CLI as an interface with all those contexts and this single, very easy schema. But you can imagine larger scale, larger code bases with more configuration that you need to enforce more type systems, more constraints, more descriptors over your configuration. Basically, Configu gives you the same complexity of managing configuration, even when your code gets larger and larger. And this is the real strength of Configu. Let's going back to the deck. So this was the demo, and thank you for your attention. And I will be very honored if you follow Configu at the Twitter, LinkedIn, GitHub, whatever you feel comfortable with. give us a star, help us in the project. You are more than welcome to email me if you have any question. Discord, of course, we also available at the Discord. And yeah, now I'm ready for questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So just before like jumping into the questions, I would like to also tell folks like they are also like expecting Hacktoberfest contributors. So I generally get a lot of questions from the community that how do we get started with open source? Well, here's a chance. Like there is a link, a GitHub link for Configu in description in comments as well. Just go to the GitHub, just run the project in your local system and check out how maybe you can start with the project. And then there is awesome community to help you to and take you forward. So we'll take the first question, Ran. So this was a question from Sukio, if I'm not pronouncing the name wrong. So how is configuration as code different from configuration management?
I would say that is not very different. So like configuration as code is one way to do configuration management. As I mentioned at my slide, I guess at the third slide when I talked about CAC, when we talked with people, we saw that each one of them, because their lack of standard, doing configuration management in his own way. It's like either it's from manual work, like changing a configuration file by hand and deploying it to production, to create some, I don't know, scripts, to create some pipeline, to create a fully featured system only for configuration that works with, I don't know, etcd or other database. So basically, configuration management can be done in many forms. And what we want to do at Configu is supplying a way that we think it's the best to do configuration management. And this way is by configuration as code, is all the baseline of our how we think about configuration is deduced from the code. So I would say, for short, configuration as code is a way to do configuration management, and it's the Configu way to do it.
I hope the question is answered, Sukyo. So now, just before moving on to the next question, I would also like to address that, like, just move on with the project. Just join the Discord community as well. And I've just heard from the team that there are like limited swags for the like new contributors as well. So just don't forget to check out the config. Yeah, so that's the really cool swag. And now let's move to the next question. So what are the like key benefits of using configuration as code, and like how does it compare to traditional configuration management approaches?
Yeah, so I talked about it a bit in the slides, and I will be happy to expand and answer it next. So traditional configuration managers approaches, as we see it, is like getting a raw text file with key equals value, key equal value, or some key value store, or a third-party system like a secret manager that has a long list of key equal value. Basically, everything in the traditional configuration management approaches is raw text, is basically a simple text, either with its file or a third-party system. So what we wanted to do with configuration as code is taking this raw approach, raw files approach, raw text approach, or free text approach, and change it and like apply the perspective around configuration. When you treat configuration as code, it's not longer a raw text. It becomes a real entity that you can enforce constraints about, like looking at its type, at its default value, at whether it's required in some scenario or not. So this is the actual benefits when you look at configuration, at application configuration specifically from the perspective of code. And when we talked with the folks, and we're still doing it continuously, we want to hear more and more approaches of how companies and teams are dealing with the configuration challenges, and how they manage their configuration internally. Um, we basically identified all those challenges that I talked in this slide. Um, so when you treat configuration as a real entity via code, you gain yourself more tracking and version capabilities. You get yourself a more reproducible way to look at configuration, to scale your application, to collaborate on configuration, and you eliminate any chance for misconfiguration because you have a clear standard to enforce whatever constraint you want the actual configuration be when you deploy your application. So it reduces all the risk with raw text, basically, and taking it to a whole new level. Hope it answers the question.
Yeah, that was a very great explanation, and it really did, explain a lot. So, moving on to the next question is, like, how do you ensure the security and the confidentiality of sensitive configuration data when you use like configuration as code?
Cool. This is a really great question. Thank you, whoever asked it. So configuration as code is practically the specification of this, I don't know, this treatment of configuration and how you declare them. At Configu, when we implemented Configu, we added another layer. So the config schema at Configu is the implementation of configuration as code. But when you attach it with the config store, as I mentioned here, you have the freedom to save the configuration wherever you like. So let's say you are counting on AWS Secret Manager or HashiCorp Vault, or whatever system that you consider yourself that is very much sensitive and like you give them the grant to save the configuration data or values for you. So what really beautiful at Configu that as the project move on, most of our contribution that we see is more and more config store. So we started the project with the JSON and SQLite store that you saw at the demo, but very quickly the community donated code to implementation of config store of HashiCorp Vault and then AWS Parameter Store and Secret Manager, and et cetera, et cetera. So you have the freedom to choose where you save your data. Configu doesn't bother it. Configu just give you the process to do it. And by applying the configuration as code, the config schema on the value when you fetch them from the store or save them to the store, it gives you the whole picture. So you can enforce another layer of security of I don't know, you can enforce type system or other constraints on the value so it won't just be a raw text. So yeah, I hope that answers the questions.
Yeah. So let's move to the next question. Like, can you share some like best practices for version control and maybe tracking changes when you are managing your configuration as code?
Yeah, totally. Let's go back to the code space as it will be very much easy. Let's create ourselves another directory and say, and I don't know, Q4 project. So as at Configu, we don't mind how much config schema you created. I can go to this Q4 project and create and do Configu in it. Dash help, you can see you can create yourself as much as config as config schema that you like. You can do config unit -- get started, and then, oh, sorry. And then you can do another config unit -- name some schema. You can like create yourself as much as schemas as you like. And this is bringing me to answer the question. We tell our users, our I don't know, collaborators, take a look at a section of your code, at the domain of the code, and see what configuration it needs. And like decide yourself if this domain is large enough to have a schema of its own, or either it's part of a larger domain or larger logic or business logic that has to have this schema. So basically, you are free to create schemas wherever you like. But the best practice, as I see it, because everyone has its own opinion, is just take a look at your project. If it's like spread across different code repositories, or it has a lot of directory and nested directory, or shared folders, or whatever, just if it has enough configuration that it needs, you can create a schema for it. And then later on, when you work with the Configu interface, either of it is the CLI or the SDK, you can pipe one Configu eval like this to another Configu eval with a different schema, to another Configu eval with the third schema, and etc., etc. And then at the end, pipe it to Configu export command and create yourself aggregated result from all of those schema. And if there are collisions of keys between those schema, the top rightmost wins. So if you piped it to the next config eval and you have the same key, the right topmost will win. So hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I totally agree with that one. And the next question I would be personally interested as well in this, like to know from you. So, like, how does configuration as code integrate with other DevOps practices and tools such as CI/CD pipelines?
Cool. So the short answer is that we have a CLI. Practically, we have a CLI. It is very easy to install on either of the CI/CD platform. You can also see that if we go into the Configu organization, we have more repository over here that has a pre-made GitHub action for etc. It's already published at the marketplace. So it's very easy to like incorporate the Configu CLI at GitHub actions. And after you basically run this step, all the subsequent steps can do the same command as I did for my local machine at the CI/CD pub. So let's say you deploying some branch of your application. So you can treat the name of the branch as your config set, as the context. And before you deploying, add some values that you need, or if it nested behind the dev environment, so you have some kind of inheritance between them. And then what you would like, so let's say it's a Python application and you want to, I don't know, wrap it with a Docker file, you can create yourself a a .env or inject it to the Docker command with the Configu CLI. Another DevOps practice is the whole world of GitOps. And as you may saw, Configu use the config schema as part of your code. You are actually pushing the config schema together with your code to the to your code repository. So this can trigger the CI/CD that looks at the context and runs some Configu export to fetch values from wherever store you put the values in. It also worth to mention that we have steps for CodeFresh, for Circle CI, Orb, and I guess also for GitLab CI/CD. And if we don't have a pre-made installation wrapper, you can just run this CURL step at either one of those, and you will have the Configu CLI installed in a minute. Yeah, Jenkins, just add an executable shell, build steps, and run it. Yeah. So hope I answered the question.
Yeah. So happy to know that we have certain like tools as well working with configuration as code. Now, the next question would be like, are there any emerging trends or future developments in configuration as code that like attendees of the webinar should be aware of?
Cool. Thank you for the question. As I mentioned, like we at Configu listen to either of our community here in GitHub and Discord, or either if the part where we develop our offering platform, the one that we sell, because we are a startup company and we need to sell something. When we talk with those persons, we learn about their scenarios and how they treat configuration. So we try to take all those ideas and put them into an issue, either if it's a feature or a chore at our repository. And then either if it's a very core and hard task, so we most of the time do it, but if it's I don't know, a new and a more easy task, we leave it to the community to do it. And this is how we implement more and more features for the configuration as code implementation of Configu. So you can take a look at this schema. If we take a look at our docs part, and if we take at the CFGU, so you can see there are a bunch of, I don't know, properties that you can attach to each of the configuration that you declare. So just for an example, we currently have a pull request for a man that adds a property called aliases to the CFGU declaration. That what it does, it's actually giving some config key and other aliases that he can declare as part of the working with Configu. So if he called some I don't know, config db-URL, and he wants and there is another call that calls this environment variable or whatever database URL, and they share the same value. So you have this alias property to name it as these two config keys. So to answer your question at short, we continuously adding more and more properties to this configuration as code file, to the CFGU, the implementation of Configu, and this is the new innovation from us on those aspects. We are also working behind the scenes on writing an official specification for configuration as code. So if someone wants to create another parallel project for configuration as code that not working with config or config set or config schema, but with other concepts and with other commands, he can follow this specification and create, how we call it, the accurate solution, the model solution to work with configuration. So hopefully I answered these questions also.
Yeah. So and we are like at the end of the session. It's about an hour. And thank you so much for sharing about configuration as code. Just before like ending the session, I would like to again go through the points that maybe there is a link in description about configure Discord. You can check that out. They are also like expecting Hacktober Fest contributions, and if you haven't started the Hacktober Fest yet, this is your chance. Like you can get started with the project and maybe move ahead with the project as well. And don't forget to join the Discord community for Configu. We'll be sharing all the links in the description, and also the slide link which was presented by Ran. And Ran, do you have any closing remarks?
I just wanted to say thank you for everyone that listened and joined us today, and say that there are a bunch of new improvements and innovations for this great Configu open source project. And we are really striving to get more and more contributors and more ideas from you as community, and learn about your scenario or how you do configuration management, because there are tons of ways to do it, and we want to be the brightening light and the most generic way to do it, so everyone can benefit. Streamline configuration management as we do with infrastructure as code, as we do with GitOps and CI/CD. We want to bring application configuration and the challenges of it to a new world, and we need you for this. So join us, and thank you for listening. And there are more to follow, more webinar, more blog posts. Stay tuned.
Yeah. So thank you so much for tuning in then, and maybe to the attendees, if you are like interested in more of such webinars, you can check out We Make This website. We will be hosting regular webinars on different topics, and see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye bye.